Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak to C-9, the anti-hate bill. Let me start by saying I hate this bill. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing that it... Actually, I try not to hold hatred in my heart for any person, but I think when you see really bad legislation, it's okay to hate it. Now, why is this really bad legislation? It has provoked a debate which pits people against each other who should totally agree. All of us in this place, liberals, conservatives, Bloc, NDP, we all want to see an end to hatred in this country. We all see it every day. The dramatic increase in acts of hatred and anti-Semitism, particularly but Islamophobia, racism, it's despicable. We stand against it. But I think Bill C-9 has gotten in the way in a way that actually ties us in knots and is making it more difficult to use the tools we already have, like Section 319 of the Criminal Code. Let me back up and say this, Mr. Speaker. I looked for the most recent statement because there have been some amendments, which I have to say, I do appreciate the amendment that says you do need the approval of an Attorney General to prosecute under this Act, but that doesn't remedy the many faults of this bill. I looked for the most recent press release from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association to make sure their views hadn't changed as a result of recent amendments, and they say very clearly, and I'm going to quote from their most recent release, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism are on the rise. Communities across this country are worried. They deserve protection, but Bill C-9 doesn't solve this complex issue. Instead, it hands the government a blunt instrument that history tells us will be turned against the very people it's supposed to help. Now, let me speak to what they're talking about. I oppose Bill C-9. Yes, I'm a practicing Christian, and yes, I believe that the texts of sacred texts of whether it's the Quran or Torah, Bible, doesn't matter. Those are religious texts. They're not hate speech. But that's not my big problem with this bill, because I think it's very, very unlikely, no matter what anyone might say for partisan reasons, that anybody in the Liberal Party wants to prosecute a preacher. That's nonsense. What we're dealing with here, though, is a bill that's so unnecessary that it creates new risks through vagueness and discretion that could create real problems that will end up before the courts and get in the way of making sure that we have the proper tools to prosecute hate crimes on the laws, with the laws we already have. Now, as somebody who looks to, why do we have C-9? Normally a bill of this weirdness would come because the courts had said something and the government felt compelled, excuse me, Mr. Speaker, I have to kind of adjust. This corner I'm in and it's really difficult. Sorry, I didn't mean to complain about the furniture in the middle of a speech. Mr. Speaker, normally something like this that appears to be redundant and discretionary and confusing would come about because the Supreme Court had said something criticizing an existing law, and the Department of Justice had tried to clarify the law with yet another law on the same subject. But this is the opposite, Mr. Speaker. The Supreme Court of Canada has already, in numerous decisions, dealt with the big problem, which we have. When you are defining hate, and when you say hate speech is a crime, and when you say there's an identifiable group against whom this speech is directed, you might have the problem, which the courts identify, and which numerous people... What about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? What about our right to free speech? What about our right to worship as we choose? What about our rights of freedom of assembly? Does this law, and I'm now referring to Section 319 of the Charter against acts of hate, do these criminal acts of hate conflict with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Now, thankfully, in Keekstra, in a couple of places, the Supreme Court of Canada has dealt with this. Law enforcement, lawyers, judges across the country have a pathway to know that you can prosecute against hate crimes under the Criminal Code and not defy the Charter. The Supreme Court of Canada has ruled on this, and their rulings are clear. Unfortunately, C-9 is not clear. C-9 creates a whole new discretionary web of things that may or may not be criminal. Now, for this, Mr. Speaker, I want to refer to a just briefly to a personal experience I had. It was a while ago. It was back in 2006. I wasn't in Parliament, but I attended a rally to decry what was then happening. Okay, plus ça change, c'est la même chose que maintenant. Israel was bombing Lebanon in an attempt to hit Hezbollah, and Hezbollah was bombing into Israel. And I was at a peace rally in Toronto. I was on the back of a flatbed truck. I remember Judy Rebick was standing with me, and I was denouncing Hezbollah for shooting rockets into Israel. And I also denounced the use of rockets from Israel hitting civilian targets in Lebanon. Now, after that rally, Mr. Speaker, it came to my attention through social media that someone had gotten a photograph of me, and behind me, what I hadn't known was behind me, was a Hezbollah flag. I wouldn't have recognized the Hezbollah flag if I'd fallen into it, but as it was behind me. I didn't know it was there. It was clearly a hate symbol, but not knowing it was there, I also equally wouldn't have known, standing there on the back of a flatbed truck, how close I was to a place of worship, or a daycare center, or a cemetery. I would have had no idea. So when I first read C-9, I thought, well, this is definitely going to impede freedom of assembly, rightful protest. It's going to be very confusing. How will law enforcement know if there's a gathering and a group of people spill onto a side street and they don't realize they might be impeding access to a church we didn't know was there? So as someone who's both a lawyer, a civil libertarian, and more than an occasional protester, I looked at this bill with alarm and thought this is going to create a lot of confusion, potentially wrongful arrests. Now, it's been referenced by some of my honorable colleagues on the conservative benches that not only does every major religious group in this country express concerns about C-9, but so too do Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the Black Legal Action Center. But I was particularly noted the brief to the committee from the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, with groups from around the world expressing concern. Because what we're seeing is intrusions on civil liberties, and they reference particularly what we're seeing in the United States, where the U.S. administration's immigration and control and enforcement group known as ICE is trampling on civil liberties and saying that person was about to do something, or that person had hate in their heart, or whatever. And what the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group told our parliamentary committee was Canada must be very, very careful. Don't create offenses that can be misunderstood. Don't give openings for an overreach by law enforcement, because we are seeing in many countries around the world overreach by law enforcement. Now, they're anticipating something that I hope we never see in Canada, although I will say that the so-called industrial resource community group of the RCMP in British Columbia in cracking down on nonviolent civil disobedience to protect old-growth forests has frequently violated the Charter. I look to them as a worrying example. But Bill C-9 not only doesn't solve problems of hate crimes, it not only doesn't give law enforcement new tools, it will create a morass. I'm absolutely certain that if this law is passed as is, it will waste police resources, waste court time, and tie people up in knots in wrongful prosecutions for things that were never hate crimes at all. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I vote against this bill.